For thousands of years, the stars have guided sailors home. But among the ancient Vikings, there were those who saw something more in the celestial light, a truth that was lost to time, until now, when marine archaeologist Dr. Astrid Larsen makes an impossible discovery in a sunken Viking vessel. She finds herself caught between two worlds, the rational science she's always trusted and an ancient power she never believed could exist. What you're about to hear has been passed down through generations of Nordic seafarers, whispered in the light of the northern stars. The water was perfect that morning, clear as glass and nearly as still. At 70 feet below the surface of the Norwegian Sea, Dr. Astrid Larsen could see the ancient shipwreck, spread out before her like a skeleton laid bare by time. Her depth gauge read steady, as she finned slowly toward the excavation site, careful not to disturb the sediment that had protected these Viking secrets for over a millennium. 20 years of marine archaeology hadn't dampened the thrill she felt each time she descended to a new discovery. But this site was different. This was personal. The trading vessel dated back to the early 9th century, the same era her family's ancestral records began. Her radio crackled. "How's the visibility down there, Astrid?" It was Lars, her research assistant, monitoring from the surface vessel. "Crystal clear," she responded, adjusting her equipment. "I'm approaching the cargo hold now." The morning light filtered through the water in pale, dancing beams, illuminating the skeletal remains of the ship's wooden ribs. Astrid had spent weeks documenting every inch of the vessel, but the cargo hold had remained sealed until now. Her team had finally received permission to breach the partially collapsed section. As she worked to clear the debris, her thoughts drifted to the call she'd ignored from her sister Helena that morning. 3 years of silence, and suddenly Helena wanted to talk. Astrid pushed the thought away, focusing instead on the task at hand. The past was easier to face than the present sometimes. The sediment cleared, revealing a dark opening. Astrid switched on her secondary light and carefully manoeuvred inside. Her heart nearly stopped when the beam caught something that sparkled. Not the dull gleam of corroded metal, but a bright, almost impossible glimmer. "Lars, are you seeing this?" She adjusted her camera to focus on the object. "Getting it now. What is that?" Nestled in a partially preserved wooden chest lay an instrument unlike anything she'd ever seen. It resembled a sextant in its basic form, but the craftsmanship was extraordinary. Made of what appeared to be bronze and silver, its surface was covered in intricate runic inscriptions that seemed to catch and hold the light in unusual ways. Despite centuries underwater, it showed absolutely no signs of corrosion. "It's some kind of navigation tool," she responded, carefully documenting its position before touching it. "But I've never seen anything like it. The preservation is impossible." Hours later, as the autumn sun began to set, Astrid sat in her research tent on the shore, the artifact laid out before her on a cushioned workspace. She'd barely spoken during the careful recovery and preliminary documentation, her mind racing with questions. The runes were unlike any she'd previously encountered, more elaborate, almost crystalline in their patterns. And there was something else. Something that made her fingers tingle every time she touched it. "The conservation team will be here in the morning," Lars said, breaking her reverie. "You should get some rest." Astrid nodded absently, but they both knew she wouldn't leave. She never did when they made significant finds. Lars gave her shoulder a gentle squeeze before leaving her alone with her thoughts and the mysterious instrument. The night grew deep, and still Astrid worked, photographing and sketching, trying to decipher the unusual runic patterns. The tent's entrance flapped in a rising wind, and she glanced up to see the northern lights beginning to dance across the sky. The sight drew her outside, the artifact still in her hands. The aurora borealis painted the heavens in sheets of green and purple, more vibrant than she'd seen in years. As she stood watching, the sextant grew warm in her hands. The runes began to glow with the same ethereal light as the aurora above. Astrid nearly dropped it in shock. The stars seemed to shift, forming patterns she'd never seen before. The sextant moved in her hands of its own accord, aligning with certain stars that burned brighter than the others. A wave of dizziness struck her, and suddenly she wasn't seeing the sky anymore. She saw Helena, her sister, driving along a coastal road. Snow was falling heavily. The car's tyres lost their grip on a sharp turn, and the guardrail gave way too easily. The vision was so vivid she could hear the screech of metal, feel the vertigo as the car began to tip toward the freezing water below. Astrid fell to her knees in the sand, gasping. The sextant was cool again, the runes dark. But the vision remained, burned into her mind with a clarity that felt more like memory than imagination. Her hands shook as she pulled out her phone and checked the weather forecast for her sister's coastal town in Denmark. Snow was expected tomorrow night. She'd always been a woman of science, of careful observation and documented facts. But as she stood under the rippling lights of the aurora, the ancient artifact heavy in her hands, she knew with bone-deep certainty that what she'd seen wasn't imagination. Somehow, the stars had shown her what was yet to come. The question was, what would she do about it? The next morning found her in her tiny office at the University of Oslo's Marine Archaeology Department, the artifact secured in a custom case on her desk. She hadn't slept. The conservation team had been politely but firmly told they'd have to wait another day. Instead, she'd spent hours researching any historical mentions of Vikings using navigational tools for more than just finding their way across the seas. Her computer screen blurred as fatigue set in. She'd found fragments, hints in the sagas of seers who read destinies in the stars, but nothing concrete enough to explain what had happened on the beach. The sextant itself defied explanation. Her preliminary tests showed metals that shouldn't have existed in the 9th century, patterns that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. A knock at her door made her jump. "Come in," she called, quickly covering the artifact with a cloth. The man who entered was easily in his 80s, tall but slightly stooped, with sharp blue eyes that carried the weight of endless winters. "Dr. Larson, I'm Erik Thorvaldsen. I believe you found something that belongs to my ancestors." Astrid straightened in her chair. "Your ancestors?" He smiled, the expression warming his weathered face. "The Thorvaldsen line goes back to the original owners of that trading vessel you're excavating. When I heard about your discovery, I knew I had to come." His eyes fixed on the covered shape on her desk. "You've seen something in it, haven't you? In the stars?" The question hit her like a physical blow. "How did you—" "Because you have the blood of the Stjornusbar, the star prophets. Just as I do." He settled into the chair across from her desk with a grace that belied his age. "Though I never had the gift myself. It chooses only a few in each generation. The last was my grandmother. Astrid's scientific mind warred with what she'd experienced. You saw something specific, yes? Something urgent? The vision of Helena's car plunging over the guardrail flashed through her mind. She glanced at her phone, no response to the 3 messages she'd sent her sister trying to warn her about driving in the snow. My sister, she admitted finally. I saw her in an accident that hasn't happened yet. Tonight. She laughed shakily. I sound insane. No, you sound like a woman who's just discovered her inheritance. Eric leaned forward. The sextant you found isn't just a navigation tool. It's one of the Sionisbar, the seeing instruments. They were created by a handful of master craftsmen who understood that the stars don't just tell us where we are. They tell us where we're going, all of us, if we know how to look. But how is it possible? And why me? Why now? The gift often awakens in times of great need. His expression grew grave. Tell me, Dr. Larson, in your vision of your sister, was it only her accident you saw? Or were there other images, other possibilities trying to break through? Astrid closed her eyes, remembering. Behind the immediate vision of Helena's car, there had been other fragments, darker shapes, larger implications she hadn't wanted to focus on. There was more, she admitted. But I couldn't make sense of it. You will learn to. But first you must understand what you've taken on. This gift, it comes with a price. Each vision will drain you physically. The more significant the event you're seeing, the greater the toll it will take. And not everyone will be happy about your ability to see what's coming. As if on cue, Astrid's office phone rang. The display showed a number she didn't recognize. Dr. Larson? The voice was smooth, cultured. This is Magnus Weber. I represent a private research foundation with considerable interest in Norse artifacts. I've just learned of your fascinating discovery, and I'd very much like to discuss acquisition. I'm sorry, but the artifact isn't for sale, Astrid cut him off. It belongs to the Norwegian government. Money is no object, Dr. Larson. And my foundation's resources could help you understand exactly what it is you found. There was something in his tone that made her uneasy. After all, some discoveries are too important to be left to academic bureaucracy. Eric's expression had darkened as he listened to her side of the conversation. When she hung up, he said quietly, "And so it begins." The gift attracts those who would use it for their own ends. Choose carefully who you trust, Dr. Larson. Starting with me. Astrid looked at the covered artifact, then at her phone with its unanswered messages to Helena. I have to try to stop this accident. Even if I'm wrong, even if I'm losing my mind, I can't just do nothing. Then let me help you understand what you're dealing with. Your gift is awakening in a time of cell phones and satellites, but its roots go back to when our ancestors read the wisdom of the gods in the stars themselves. You'll need to know both worlds to use it properly. Outside her office window, clouds were gathering. Soon they would obscure the stars, and somewhere on a coastal road in Denmark, time was running out for her sister. Whatever she was going to do, she had to decide now. The sextant hummed softly under its cloth cover, calling her to a destiny she never could have imagined. And somewhere in the back of her mind, those darker visions waited to be understood, hinting at choices far more difficult than this first one. Astrid reached for her phone again, her decision made. Some bridges couldn't be mended, but maybe they could be rebuilt. Even if Helena wouldn't listen to her warning, she had to try. And then, she would begin to learn what it truly meant to read prophecies in starlight. The clock read 9:47 p.m. when Astrid pulled her car into the ferry terminal at Hirtshals. Snow was falling in thick, wet flakes exactly as she'd seen in her vision. Her hands trembled slightly on the steering wheel, partly from the 3 cups of coffee she'd consumed during the drive from Oslo, partly from the residual exhaustion of another vision that had struck just before she'd left. This one hadn't been about Helena. It had been something larger, more catastrophic, glimpses of ground splitting open, of waves higher than buildings. But she couldn't focus on that for now, one impossible thing at a time. Her phone buzzed. Eric's name appeared on the screen. "Are you there yet?" The old man's voice was taut with concern. "Just arrived. The next ferry leaves in 20 minutes. I'll be in Frederikshavn by 11, and then it's another hour to Helena's place." If her sister was still taking the same route home from work that she always had. If she was even still working at the same hospital, 3 years was a long time. "The stars are hidden here," Eric said. "The storm stretches across the whole region. You won't be able to see any new warnings tonight." "I know." Astrid rubbed her temples, fighting off a headache. "But I can't just sit in Oslo and wait to see if my vision comes true." "Be careful. Magnus Weber has resources everywhere. I've been making calls. He's been collecting artifacts like the sextant for years. Always through legitimate channels at first, but when that doesn't work." Eric let the implication hang. Astrid glanced at her back seat where the sextant lay hidden in her old diving gear bag. She hadn't dared leave it behind. "I'll check in when I reach Denmark." The ferry crossing was rough, the North Sea angry beneath the storm. Astrid stood at the rail despite the cold, watching the snow swirl in the ship's lights. Other passengers huddled inside, but she needed the sharp air to keep her alert. The vision of the accident kept replaying in her mind, along with fragments of the other one, the one she was trying not to think about. Her phone chimed. A text from an unknown number. "Dr. Larson, your precipitous departure from Oslo is ill-advised. The artifact requires proper study. Let me send a car for you in Frederikshavn. We can discuss terms. Magnus Weber." She deleted it without responding. Another text arrived immediately. "The weather is quite dangerous tonight. It would be tragic if anything happened to you or your sister." Astrid's hands clenched on the railing. The casual threat confirmed everything Eric had warned about. She texted Helena again. "Please don't drive the coastal road tonight. Emergency. Call me." Still no response. The ferry docked in Frederikshavn under worsening conditions. Astrid's windshield wipers could barely keep up with the snow as she drove south. The coastal road wound along the eastern edge of Denmark like a dark ribbon, treacherous in the best conditions. She pressed down on the accelerator. A police car flashed past in the opposite direction, lights spinning, and her heart lurched. Was she already too late? The radio crackled with weather warnings in Danish. Astrid almost missed the black sedan that pulled out behind her from a side road. Almost. Years of working on research vessels had taught her to notice everything in her mirrors. The car stayed a consistent distance behind her for the next 10 kilometres. Her phone rang. She put it on the speaker. "Where are you?" Eric's voice was urgent. "About 40 minutes from Helena's town. But I've picked up a tail. Black sedan, tinted windows. Magnus? He must have people watching the ferry terminals." Eric swore softly in Norwegian. "Astrid, there's something else you need to know. I found references to your other vision, the one about geological events. There are similar descriptions in my grandmother's journals. She saw something coming, something big, but she died before she could specify when." The sedan behind her was getting closer. "Eric, I need to focus on driving right now. The road..." The headache she'd been fighting suddenly intensified. The stars were hidden by storm clouds, but she could feel them burning above, trying to show her something new. The sextant in her back seat began to hum. The vision hit her like a physical blow. She saw Helena again, but this time she saw what caused the accident. A black sedan forcing her off the road. Not an accident at all. And behind that image, she saw something else. Magnus Weber standing in a room full of artifacts like her sextant, using them to predict market crashes, natural disasters, elections. Using them to reshape the world for profit. And behind that, the ground splitting open, the waves rising. She snapped back to the present as her car began to drift. The sedan behind her was almost at her bumper now. Her hands shook violently. This vision had taken more out of her than any before. But she forced herself to focus. She knew these roads from childhood visits to her grandmother. There was a turn-off coming up, a maintenance road that led down to the beach. "Eric," she managed, "I need you to call the police." "Helena's not the target tonight." "I am." She ended the call and gripped the wheel tighter. The turnoff was just ahead, unmarked and easy to miss in the snow. At the last possible second, she yanked the wheel hard. Her car fishtailed but held the turn. The sedan shot past, unable to react in time. The maintenance road was little more than a dirt track, now slick with snow. Astrid fought for control as she descended toward the beach. The sedan's brake lights flared above as it turned around. Another vision flickered at the edges of her consciousness, trying to break through, but she pushed it back. She couldn't afford the weakness now. The beach appeared ahead, dark and empty in the storm. Astrid pulled onto the wet sand, tyres spinning. The sedan's headlights appeared at the top of the road. She grabbed her phone and the bag containing the sextant, then slipped out of her car. The wind hit her like a wall, driving snow and sea spray into her face. She could barely see, but she knew these beaches. There were caves ahead, worn into the soft limestone cliffs. If she could reach them before the sedan made it down. The humming from her bag grew stronger, harmonizing with the wind. The stars were up there, hidden but watching, trying to tell her something important. The headlights behind her illuminated the snow in harsh bars of white. She ran. The wet sand dragged at her feet, and exhaustion from the visions made every step an effort. A gunshot cracked behind her, shockingly loud over the wind. They weren't even trying to be subtle now. The caves appeared out of the darkness, black mouths in the white cliff face. Astrid dove into the nearest one, scraping her hands on the rough walls as she felt her way deeper. The sextant's humming had become almost musical, rising and falling with the rhythm of the waves outside. Footsteps crunched on sand. A flashlight beam swept the cave entrance. "Dr. Larson?" Magnus Weber's cultured voice echoed off the limestone. "Please be reasonable. Men like me have always guided the course of history. Think what we could accomplish together, knowing what's coming. We could save lives. By deciding who gets saved?" Astrid pressed herself against the cave wall. "By playing God with the future? The future is coming whether we play with it or not. The disaster you saw, it's inevitable. The only question is who benefits from knowing about it first." The sextant's humming peaked. The stars were trying to tell her something, even through the storm clouds and rock above. She needed to look, needed to understand, but a vision now would leave her helpless. Another set of headlights appeared on the beach. Then another. Car doors slammed. "Police. Drop your weapons." Magnus swore. Gunshots echoed, this time answered by police fire. Astrid seized her chance. She scrambled deeper into the cave, feeling her way by touch, while chaos erupted outside. The cave opened up slightly. The sextant's hum changed tone, becoming almost urgent. There was something here, something important. She fumbled for her phone's flashlight. The beam revealed more runic carvings on the cave wall, identical to those on the sextant. This had been a sacred place once, a place where her ancestors had come to read the stars. And there, half buried in the sand, another artifact crusted with centuries of the mineral deposits. Footsteps approached. Astrid raised a rock, ready to defend herself. "Dr. Larson." A woman's voice, speaking Danish. "Please. Are you hurt?" Astrid lowered the rock. "I'm here. I'm okay. Your friend Eric called us. And your sister Helena. She's a nurse at the hospital. She's on her way." Helena was coming. She was safe. She hadn't been on the coastal road after all. Astrid sagged against the cave wall, the strength leaving her legs. The sextant hummed one final time. The clouds outside parted just enough to let a single star shine through the cave entrance. Its light struck the buried artifact, making the runes glow softly. The vision, when it came, was gentler than the others. She saw a network of caves all along the coast, each containing pieces of her ancestors' legacy. She saw other star prophets through history, learning to balance knowledge of the future with the wisdom to know when to act and when to let events unfold. She saw the disaster that was coming, and more importantly, she saw what needed to be done about it. But first, she had a sister to reconnect with, and a lot to learn about her newfound gift. Through the cave entrance, she could see Magnus and his men being led away in handcuffs. The snow was finally letting up. Soon the stars would be visible again, ready to share their secrets with anyone who knew how to listen. Astrid reached down and brushed away more sand from the buried artifact. There would be time for that mystery later. For now, she needed to focus on the present, on family, on healing, on understanding the responsibility that came with seeing the future. She stepped out of the cave just as another car pulled up. Helena climbed out, her scrub still visible under her winter coat. Their eyes met across the beach, and 3 years of silence suddenly seemed like nothing at all. Some bridges couldn't be mended. but sometimes the stars showed you where to build new ones. 3 months had passed since the night on the beach. The winter sun hung low over Oslo's harbour as Astrid spread her research across Eric's kitchen table. H's sister Helena sat beside her, marking coordinates on a map while Eric made coffee. The prophecies had been coming more frequently now. Each one left her a little more drained, but she was learning to manage the toll. The cave network they'd discovered along Denmark's coast had yielded 4 more artifacts, each one adding pieces to a puzzle that grew more urgent by the day. Another tremor near the Storegga shelf, Helena said, marking the map with a red pin. That's the 3rd this week. Astrid nodded, sorting through printouts of seismic data. Her sister had taken a leave of absence from the hospital to help, her medical training proving unexpectedly valuable in understanding how the visions affected Astrid physically. 3 years of estrangement had dissolved in the face of something far bigger than their old grievances. Magnus's trial starts next week, Eric said, setting down coffee cups. His lawyers are pushing for a psychological evaluation. They're claiming he had a mental break, that all his talk about seeing the future was delusion. Better they think him mad than believe the truth, Astrid replied. She touched the sextant, which hummed softly in response. But we're running out of time. The visions had become crystal clear, a massive underwater landslide along the continental shelf, triggered by melting methane deposits. The resulting tsunami would devastate Norway's western coast. She'd seen it from every angle, waves higher than Oslo's buildings, entire coastal communities washed away. But knowing the future and preventing it were 2 very different things. The Geological Survey team still won't listen, Helena asked. They say the data doesn't support our conclusions. Astrid rubbed her temples. And we can't exactly tell them we know because of prophetic visions from ancient Viking artifacts. The coffee grew cold as they worked through the afternoon. Star charts and geological surveys covered every surface. 3 generations of Thorvaldsen family journals lay open, their pages filled with similar warnings throughout history. As sunset approached, Astrid felt the familiar tingling that preceded a vision. The sextant's hum deepened. "Quick!" she gasped. Helena was already there with monitoring equipment, heart rate, blood pressure, brain activity. They'd learned that understanding the physical effects of the visions might be key to managing them. The stars spoke through clouds and daylight, showing her possibilities that branched like rivers. She saw the landslide again, but this time she saw its weak points, its pressure valves. She saw where the Earth could be convinced to shift gradually rather than catastrophically. When the vision released her, she was shaking but still conscious. Helena pressed a glucose drink into her hand while Eric steadied her. "There's a way," Astrid said once she could speak. "The landslide, it's like a dam about to burst. But if we could release the pressure slowly in controlled bursts..." "The oil rigs," Eric said suddenly. "They already have the equipment for controlled underwater detonations. And I still have contacts in the Coastal Administration. But we'd need proof." Helena traced the fault lines they'd mapped. Real, scientific proof that they'd accept. Astrid looked at the sextant, then at the star charts. "The artifacts don't just show the future. They show us how to read the present more clearly. All the signs are there in the geological data. We just need to help them see the pattern." She worked through the night, fueled by coffee and urgency. Helena's medical knowledge helped translate the vision's physical effects into data points. Eric's historical records showed similar patterns of prediction and prevention going back centuries. By morning, they had a presentation that even the most skeptical scientist would have to consider. The patterns were undeniable once you knew how to read them. Subtle changes in seabed composition, temperature variations that matched her visions exactly. But as they prepared to leave for the geological survey offices, the sextant's hum changed tone. The morning stars, still visible in the dawn sky, pulled at her consciousness. The vision struck without warning, the strongest she'd ever experienced. She saw two possible futures with perfect clarity. In one, they convinced the authorities in time, and the controlled detonations prevented catastrophe. In the other, she saw Magnus in his prison cell writing equations on the wall. Somehow, he'd learned to see fragments of the future even without artifacts. He was arranging for the information to reach specific investors who would profit from the disaster. The waves would still come, but some would be ready. The wrong people would be ready. Astrid returned to consciousness on Eric's couch. Helena was taking her pulse, her face tight with worry. "Your heart stopped for 6 seconds, her sister said quietly. "We almost lost you." "The visions are getting stronger," Eric added. "The closer we get to the event, the more they'll demand from you. That's what happened to my grandmother in the end." Astrid tried to sit up, but her body felt like lead. "We have to split up," she managed. "The geological survey, yes, but someone has to go to the prison. Magnus has to be stopped from passing on what he knows." "You're in no condition to do either," Helen insisted. "The gift chose you," Eric said, "but you don't have to bear it alone. Let us be your hands and feet for this part. Tell us what to do." Outside, a new day was dawning over Oslo. Somewhere beneath the cold waters of the Norwegian Sea, pressure was building. Time was running out for both futures she'd seen. Astrid looked at the sextant, then at her sister and her mentor. The stars had shown her the way, but they'd also shown her something else. The strength of bonds rebuilt, the power of shared purpose. Sometimes the future needed more than a single prophet to change its course. "All right," she said. "Here's what we need to do." The next 48 hours passed in a blur of action. Helena, with her gift for translating complex medical data into clear presentations, took their findings to the geological survey. Eric, whose reputation still carried weight in certain circles, made calls to old contacts in the coastal administration and prison system. Astrid herself fought through the exhaustion to make one final prophetic reading. As the evening stars emerged, she used every artifact they'd gathered, combining their powers to see not just what might happen, but what needed to be done to ensure the better future prevailed. The visions nearly killed her. For 13 seconds, according to Helena's equipment, her heart stopped completely. But when she opened her eyes, she knew with certainty that they would succeed. 2 weeks later, she stood on the deck of a research vessel, watching the controlled detonations send careful ripples through the sea. Below, the seabed shifted gently, releasing its pent-up pressure in manageable waves rather than catastrophe. In his cell, Magnus raged at walls now emptied of calculations, his nascent visions fading as the future he'd glimpsed dissolved into a new possibility. The sextant hung quiet at her belt, its purpose fulfilled for now. But she knew there would be other visions, other challenges. The stars had so much more to show her. Helena joined her at the railing while Eric watched from the bridge above. The sun was setting and the first stars were becoming visible in the darkening sky. "What do they tell you now?" Helena asked softly. Astrid smiled, feeling the familiar tingle of starlight on her skin. "That some things are worth saving. And that the future isn't just written in the stars, it's written in what we choose to do about what they show us." Above them, the evening star blazed like a beacon, guiding them home across waters now made safe by the marriage of ancient wisdom and modern action. The prophecies would continue, but Astrid was ready for them now. After all, she was her ancestor's daughter, a reader of stars, a knower of things to come. and she was no longer alone.